Hi, and welcome to the fully taxable equivalent yield discussion. Now this handout, we're going to be looking at municipal bonds, and we're going to be discussing the tax advantages of them and how to calculate and compare them to corporate bonds. So the FTEY, the fully taxable equivalent yield, it's a formula that helps us convert a municipal yield into an equivalent tax yield. So a corporate bond is already expressed in a fully taxable yield, since you pay full taxes on a corporate bond, and that's why you don't see any change between the yield and the fully taxable equivalent yield, because they're the same thing. In a municipal, we have a yield that doesn't account for the tax savings. So if this is my federal tax rate, to calculate my equivalent yield, meaning I'm taking my 5.5% and adding to it the tax savings as part of my yield, and I'm using the formula yield divided by 1 minus the federal funds rate, the federal tax rate. You see C6 divided by 1 minus C7, and I get a yield of 9.09%. So in this case, the corporate bond has a higher yield. So let's go on to the next example, and we see here that in this case as well, a corporate of 10% and a muni of 8%. The corporate is expressed as fully taxable, but the municipal, when the formula is applied to express it as fully taxable, we find that the municipal is a better investment than the corporate here, because we earn equivalent of 11.11%. Okay, so let's move down here to the third example, and again, even a bond at 6.25%, because it's such a high tax bracket, we have a fully taxable yield that's greater than the corporate bond. But what if you're in a lower tax bracket? So over here, or 15% tax bracket, and we can see that a 7% bond against a 10% corporate bond, the corporate has a higher equivalent yield than the muni because of the low tax bracket. And if our tax bracket was 10%, the yield will be only 7.78, because it's the lower the tax bracket, the lower the benefit we're getting from the tax savings. And if this was at a higher tax bracket, we'll see that it actually would be a higher yield than the corporate. But since it's at the 15% level, you'd be better off at that income level getting the corporate bond at 10% rather than the muni at 7%. Okay, so let's move on to the next scenario. Some municipal bonds are federal and state tax-free. So majority of state-issued municipal bonds are federal and state tax-free. Some, like in the case of this first example here, are only federal tax-free, but the better ones are state and federal tax-free. So we have to change the formula here to include that. So we take the bond yield and we're going to divide that by the federal tax, the state tax rate times 1 minus the federal tax rate. Add that to the federal tax rate, and then we're going to say minus 1 from that, and then we'll have that number. We'll take the bond yield and divide into that number to get the new percentage. So here we have both the federal and state tax rates. So again, the corporate is fully expressed in a taxable equivalency already, so no calculation is needed. But the municipal, I'm going to have to take, and up here, the bond yield, C22, and divide that by 1 minus C23, which is to add to C24 times 1 minus C23, the federal tax rate, just like this formula denotes. And I have these brackets set up to make sure I dictate the order of operations to make sure my formula is correct. Now, in this case, the 6.375% municipal bond is equivalent to 11.93% fully taxable. So that has the higher yield, and this is the bond you should buy if you have the choice between just these two. Now let's move over to this scenario. What if the bond, we have a higher state rate and a lower municipal percentage? What would be happening here? Okay, so here we see the corporate again is 10%, but this muni, because we're starting at such a low 4.25% return, this municipal only has an equivalent yield of 9.02 return, so we would choose the corporate bond in this case. Now if we move down here, we have a lower federal and state tax rate. We see that again, because of the lower tax rate, even though the municipal bond is higher, but we have a lower federal and a lower state tax rate, the corporate bond at 10% has a higher yield, and that should be invested in. So in our last example, we have again, the corporate bond is fully expressed, but the municipal, after the tax rate of 28% and 5%, has a 10.09%, so that would be slightly higher, and that would be the desired bond to invest in. So again, we're just turning oranges and apples to apples and apples, so they're comparable. So these formulas are making corporate and municipal bonds comparable. Now there's a third scenario, and in the third scenario, we could have a federal bond that's exempt from state tax. And why these bonds do this is if you're the federal government issuing bonds, you don't want the states to interfere with the federal government's ability to issue and raise money, because the states could all put a 99% tax on the federal bonds, and then no one would buy them. And that's why the states, they get federal tax free, because they don't want the federal government to be able to interfere in their ability to raise money. Because if the federal government wanted to pick on a state, they could raise the taxes on their bonds, or make them fully, no tax benefit on their bonds. They could pass a law, and then states wouldn't be able to raise money efficiently. So that's why we have these tax deductible scenarios. So in this case, the formula again, once again, is the bond yield divided by 1 minus the state tax rate. Here's the formula. Bond yield divided by 1 minus state tax rate. It's similar to the formula above, but here we're using state tax rate instead of federal tax rate. And again, the corporates are always expressed in a fully taxable equivalent yield. It's the munis that need to be calculated. So in this calculation, the municipal is better than the corporate. Here the corporate is better than the municipal. And here we have, again, the corporate is better than the municipal bond because it has a higher rate. And once again, the, this is a little error here. All right, that's better. That's because I copied the wrong formula. But okay, so to reiterate, in this case, the muni is better than the corporate. In this case, the corporate is better than municipal. And in this case, municipal has a higher rate than the corporate, after we take into account the tax savings and convert the municipal to a fully equivalent tax yield. Okay, so that is this handout. And remember that all handouts are available on Blackboard, and on Blackboard the answer keys are also there, so you could see up close the formulas if you're having trouble calculating these problems. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you next time.